Hello all, this is Dr. Alsop, and in this third block of videos, we are going to discuss the musculoskeletal regional anatomy of the thorax, abdomen, and the upper limb. And we're going to start with bones of the thorax. So quite a bit to go through. Obviously, we've discussed the vertebrae already in terms of the thoracic vertebrae, which are a component of the thorax. So that means we need to continue our discussion with the sternum and the ribs, which are the rest of the part. Oftentimes you'll hear the terms thoracic cage, thoracic wall. When we're talking about the thoracic wall, generally you're talking about the ribs and the sternum component. And so that's what we'll be focusing more on, is that thoracic wall, as we've already discussed the thoracic vertebrae. And there's lots of functions associated with the thorax or the thoracic cage. Probably the most intuitive one is that it will protect the organs. So obviously we can think about the organs that we kind of think about more in this area. So the heart is going to be right underneath there. The lungs are going to be there, but components that are associated with the abdomen that project a little bit more superiorly, such as the spleen, a good amount of the liver, a little bit of the kidneys, those are also going to be protected by the thoracic wall. Also importantly, the thoracic cage is going to play a role in terms of breathing and helping to facilitate it. So that rhythmic type of movement that occurs with the respiratory muscles will allow for the thoracic cage to expand, and that creates a vacuum which can draw air into the lungs. And when that is compressed, it will allow air to be expelled as well. So playing an important role there as well. And then last but not least, but obviously important in terms of musculoskeletal anatomy, this region is going to serve as an attachment point for many muscles that are associated with the upper limb. And we'll talk about those when we get to the muscles. So let's talk, we'll start with the most anterior bone, and this is the sternum. This is going to it's going to be more in the midline. It's going to directly overlie much of that mediastinal viscera. And there are three parts. These are generally joined by symphyses, even though the literature kind of goes back and forth in terms of some of that. And many times the symphysis will turn into a synostosis or a bony joint in older individuals. The most superior is going to be the manubrium. That means handle. So it's kind of like the handle of the sternum. I've seen it described as kind of the top of a necktie, and I can't kind of get that out of my head. So sometimes that helps there. The middle portion, or the longest portion, is the body. And the most irregularly shaped and most inferior portion is going to be the xiphoid process. When we are looking at the manubrium, particularly the superior most portions of the manubrium, there are two general areas, really three, when you talk about the pairs, that are very prominent. And then in the case of the jugular notch, which I'm outlining right here, is palpable. So that can help in terms of better understanding that region. So right here in the midline, this kind of divot that you can feel right here on yourself, that's going to be the jugular, sometimes referred to as the suprasternal notch. And the trachea is going to be just deep to this structure. And then on either side of that jugular notch, there will be other divots that during life, this is where the medial end or sternal ends of the clavicles will articulate to create those sternoclavicular joints, which is a type of synovial joint that will allow some movement of the clavicles. Now, the area between the manubrium and the body is this region right here called the sternal angle. And the sternal angle is also palpable. So generally you can palpate the jugular notch and then move down just a little bit inferiorly. And the most anterior projecting part of the sternum is this sternal angle. And so generally what you can do is palpate that sternal angle. And you know that you are at the level of the second rib in terms of where the second rib will attach. And that helps in terms of being able to count ribs. And you'll talk about this a bit more when you get into the cardio portion of the course, but that can help in terms of being able to get a better idea of where to put the bell of the stethoscope in order to be able to hear different heart sounds. So being able to count those ribs is helpful there. Moving on to the ribs, which have a close relationship to the sternum, there are 12 pairs of ribs. So there are 12 right ribs, there are 12 left ribs. There is variation in terms of the amount, but it's not specific to any type of sex or specific ancestries or so forth. So there can be variation, but for the most part, all individuals are going to have these 12 pairs of ribs. There are what's referred to as true ribs. These are generally the first through the seventh ribs. So first is going to be the most superior, and they reduce in terms of numbers. And they're called true ribs because each one of these will attach to the sternum via their own costal cartilage. And costal cartilage is just a strip of hyaline cartilage that's actually a remnant of the ossification process that occurred. So the ribs turned into bone, and then there's this remnant of cartilage that maintains, and it helps in terms of the elasticity of the rib cage. The false ribs also have costal cartilages associated with them, but they have an indirect connection to the sternum, so they don't have a 1-to-1 ratio. So you see this third rib has its own costal cartilage and it goes to the sternum. Whereas the 8th through the 10th, and sometimes the 7th, you will see that these kind of have their costal cartilage, but they join up to form this one connection to the sternum, and this will form this costal margin. And then last but not least, we have what's referred to as floating ribs, or sometimes you hear them referred to as free ribs. These do have costal cartilages associated with them, but generally it's just a little bit that does not extend all the way up to the sternum. And so these are generally your 11th and your 12th rib, sometimes the 10th rib. Between the ribs and the costal cartilages, you will have what's referred to as intercostal spaces. And these are named according to the rib forming the superior border. So that 4th intercostal space is going to be between ribs 4 and 5. So that's how these are named. And this will be filled in during life with muscles. And we'll talk about that when we get to the muscles of the thorax. And then just to kind of reiterate, you do have this fairly prominent costal margin or arch that is formed by that shared cartilages of those ribs in this general region, these false ribs here. And you can palpate kind of where your costal margin is. Now, we know we talked about how the ribs are going to articulate with the sternum, but they're also going to articulate with thoracic vertebrae. And you recall we had a little bit of this discussion here. We've seen this image before. So that head of the rib is going to articulate with the body or bodies of these thoracic vertebrae. And then that there is a tubercle. You can see this on this rib that's not articulating, just distal to the head, that is going to articulate with the transverse processes of those thoracic vertebrae. So you have 2 separate joints formed by the ribs and the thoracic vertebrae. And I do want to mention one of the more unique ribs. The 11th and the 12th ribs are fairly rudimentary. There's not much going on there. They're usually pretty distinct. In addition, the first rib is quite distinct. It is the most curved. It's very sharply curved in comparison to the rest of the ribs. It's broader, it's shorter, and it's a bit more rugose because you're going to have more muscles than just the intercostal muscles that are attaching here. Specifically, the anterior scalene is going to attach here, which is one of the deep muscles of the neck. We didn't talk too much about this, this particular muscle, but it is going to form a fairly prominent bump or tubercle on this rib. Now, what I think is cool about the first rib is that, so it's the most superior rib, as the number 1 would suggest, but a good amount of this rib is actually going to lie above the level of the clavicle. So it is very associated with the root of the neck region, and it's quite deep. So it's not easily palpable like many of the other ribs of the thoracic cage. All right, excellent. We have made it to our review question. So the clavicle, we'll talk a bit more about the clavicle when we get to the upper limb, but that's going to be your collarbone. I think we're all pretty familiar with where that is. That's going to articulate with which part of the sternum? Is it the body? Is it the manubrium? or is it the xiphoid process? Pause the video if you need to, and when you're ready, let's talk about how B, the manubrium, or that most superior portion, is the correct answer. So you can see that handle here of the sternum articulating with the clavicles on either side and those clavicular notches that we discussed. So it makes sense. The clavicles are a bit more superior, so it's going to be articulating with that superior most portion. And I really think that this is a cool joint. This is where you're having the articulation of bones of the upper limb with the axial skeleton. It's really the only place that occurs. So we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to the upper limb as well. All right, thank you so much for your time and attention here. As always, please reach out if you have any questions. See you in the next video.